Officers put her in handcuffs now. That was the first thing I heard when I stepped outside. HOA Karen stood in the middle of the street finger, jabbing at my wife as if she were pointing out a fugitive. My wife wasn't yelling, stealing, or threatening anyone. She was simply standing in our own driveway, the early sun catching on her freshly shaved head. She had shaved it herself just days before, because chemo had already started to take what cancer hadn't. But in Karen's kingdom of pettiness, a bald head was offensive, a violation of her HOA's sacred dress code. And today she'd gone so far as to call the cops, demanding they haul a cancer patient off like a criminal. What she didn't realize, what none of the neighbors filming on their phones realized, was that I wasn't just a husband standing on the porch. I was the sheriff of this county. And I was about to show Karen what happens when her clipboard crusade collides with the law. Before we get into what happened next, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The funny thing about living in an HOA neighborhood is that you never expect the war to start over something as human as raw as illness. Most people imagine the usual scuffles, arguments over lawn heights, mailboxes that don't match, or maybe a neighbor's fence being 3 inches too high. But my family, our crime was that my wife got cancer. Her name is Angela. She's 50 years old, proud, graceful, and stronger than anyone gives her credit for. When the diagnosis came, it hit us like a freight train. Stage 2, breast cancer. The treatments began quickly, and within a few weeks the chemo started doing what chemo always does: it stole her hair. Angela, being Angela, refused to let the disease or the medicine humiliate her. One Saturday morning she asked me to bring the clippers out to the porch. With steady hands she shaved her head herself, every pass of the blade, a statement: I am not afraid. I am still me. I'll never forget how beautiful she looked that day. Bald, yes, but glowing, defiant. And when she smiled at me afterward, I swore I saw a warrior queen standing in my driveway. Unfortunately, not everyone saw what I saw. Karen did. Karen was the president of our HOA, and she treated the title like she'd been crowned empress of the cul-de-sac. She was the kind of woman who wore her sunglasses like armor heels, clicking across the pavement like she was inspecting troops. And the moment she spotted Angela walking out with her bald head uncovered, Karen's face twisted in disgust. By the next morning, we had a letter taped to our front door. Violation: non-compliance with HOA appearance standards. Residents must maintain neat, attractive, and community-friendly presentation. Failure to correct will result in fines of $250 per day. I laughed when I read it at first. I mean, how do you correct cancer? Was Karen expecting me to superglue a wig on my wife's head? But Angela didn't laugh. She folded the letter carefully, as if it were fragile, and tucked it in a drawer. "Let it go," she whispered. "It's not worth the fight." But Karen didn't let it go. The fines started piling up: $250 a day, then threats of liens against our property if we didn't pay. Soon we had neighbors dropping subtle comments. "Tough break, John," one of them said, eyes flicking toward Angela. Another muttered, "Rules are rules, you know." The gossip spread like wildfire. Some people avoided Angela entirely, as though her bald head were contagious. It burned me up inside. Not just as a husband, but as a man sworn to uphold the law. I knew every statute in our county, every real rule that mattered, and nothing in any law book said a woman couldn't shave her head. Nothing said a homeowner association president could turn illness into a fine. But Karen didn't deal in laws, she dealt in fear. She believed her clipboard carried more power than the Constitution, and she was testing just how far she could push us. One evening, I found Angela crying in the bathroom. She had always been composed, even stubbornly strong, but that night I saw the cracks. "John," she whispered, "maybe we should just move. Maybe it's easier." That's when the fire in me turned into steel. "No," I told her. "This is our home. They don't get to bully you out of it, not while I'm breathing." From then on, I started collecting evidence. I photographed every notice Karen posted on our door. I recorded every voicemail she left on our answering machine, dripping with venom about keeping up appearances, and I logged every fine, every penny they claimed we owed. But Karen wasn't content with paperwork. She began cornering Angela in the driveway. "You're bringing down the neighborhood," she'd sneer loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "It's bad enough to be sick, you don't have to flaunt it." Angela, bless her soul, never took the bait. She would stand there, shoulders straight, meeting Karen's eyes with a calm that I envied. She never yelled, she never cursed. She simply said, "I'm living my life, Karen. You should try it sometime." And that calmness infuriated Karen even more. Because bullies feed on reaction, and when you deny them that satisfaction, they grow desperate. Soon after, Karen sent out an HOA-wide newsletter. In it, she warned that unsightly appearances could damage property values and that residents should respect community standards to avoid penalties. She didn't mention Angela by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. Neighbors started whispering when we walked by. Some sympathetic, some cold. I caught one woman shaking her head, muttering shame. Such a pretty neighborhood, too. That night, as I sat on the porch with Angela, I asked her how she kept her composure through it all. She looked at me tired but serene and said, "Because if I let her steal my peace, then she wins twice. Cancer takes enough, I won't let her take my dignity too." Her words etched themselves into me. But even as she found strength, I felt the storm building inside me. Because here's the thing. I'm a sheriff. I know when a situation is about to escalate, and every instinct in my gut told me Karen wasn't finished. This wasn't just about HOA fines anymore. This was about power, control. And Karen was about to push harder than she ever had before. And when she did, she would learn the one truth about picking fights in my neighborhood. You never pick a fight with a sheriff's wife. If Karen had stopped at fines and gossip, maybe, just maybe, things would have fizzled out. People get petty in neighborhoods. You learn to live with it. But Karen wasn't satisfied with paperwork taped to our door. No, she wanted a stage, an audience, and my wife's dignity dragged across it. That stage came in the form of the monthly HOA meeting. These meetings were usually boring affairs, arguments about sprinkler schedules, whether Christmas lights could stay up past January, or how much to spend on repainting the tennis courts. But this time, the community center was packed. It wasn't coincidence. Karen had invited everyone. She had a show planned, and Angela was the unwilling star. Angela almost didn't go. She hated confrontation, especially now when her body was weak and tired from treatment. But I told her, if we don't show up, Karen wins by default. Sometimes silence looks like guilt. Angela sighed, slipped a scarf over her bald head, and held my hand all the way there. The meeting began with the usual droning of minutes and budgets. I could see neighbors shifting in their plastic chairs, restless. They weren't here for accounting. They were waiting for Karen's fireworks. And she didn't disappoint. "Next order of business," Karen said, rising from her seat at the front. She adjusted her blazer like a politician, about to deliver a speech. Community appearance violations. Her eyes scanned the crowd before landing squarely on Angela. "As you all know," she continued, voice rising with feigned authority, "our HOA standards require that homeowners maintain appearances that reflect the values of Maple Crest. Unfortunately, we've had ongoing issues with one household refusing to comply. Issues that negatively affect all of us, our property values, our community image, our neighborhood pride." I felt Angela's hand tense in mine. She pulled her scarf a little tighter. Karen wasn't subtle. She clicked her heels, crossed the room, and stood directly in front of Angela. "This household," she said, gesturing dramatically, "has chosen to disregard repeated notices. The resident insists on parading around with an appearance that is disruptive, unsightly, and frankly," she paused for effect, letting the silence hang unneighborly. Gasps and whispers rippled through the room. Some people looked horrified at Karen's cruelty. Others looked down at their shoes, unwilling to meet Angela's eyes. And then, as if she hadn't gone far enough, Karen leaned forward and sneered, "If you can't keep up appearances, maybe this neighborhood isn't the right fit for you." Angela didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply pulled the scarf off her head, revealing her bare scalp shiny under the fluorescent lights. A hush fell over the room. "This isn't a hairstyle," Angela said softly, her voice steady. "This is cancer. This is chemotherapy. This is me fighting for my life. If that offends you, I suggest you look in the mirror and ask yourself why." The room froze. Even I had goosebumps hearing her. My wife, the woman who spent nights curled up sick from chemo, just stood in a crowded room and turned Karen's insult into a battle cry. "But Karen," she laughed. "Oh, please," she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "We all have problems. That doesn't give you an excuse to bring down the entire community. There are wigs, scarves, hats. You could have chosen dignity. Instead, you chose this." The cruelty was so sharp I heard an audible gasp from the back of the room. A few neighbors muttered, "That's too far." One woman actually stood up and said, "Karen, she has every right to be here." But Karen wasn't listening. She turned to the board, slapping her clipboard down like a gavel. I motioned that we fine the Carroll household double for continued non-compliance. If they refuse, we pursue legal eviction under the HOA charter. That was the moment my sheriff instinct screamed at me. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was an abuse of authority in writing in public in front of witnesses. She was laying the groundwork for something bigger. I rose to my feet, towering over Karen, and spoke with calm steel. "Karen, my wife, has committed no violation of law, no violation of any actual legal bylaw. What you're doing here isn't enforcement, it's harassment. Karen sneered at me, eyes narrowing. Who are you to lecture me about the law? I almost pulled my badge out right then and there. But I didn't. Not yet. I knew timing was everything. Instead, I leaned closer and said, "You'll find out soon enough." The room buzzed with tension. Some neighbors whispered support for Angela. Others looked away, terrified of getting on Karen's bad side. I could see the fear she had cultivated, her little empire of intimidation. But here's the thing about empires. They collapse the moment someone stands up and says enough. When the meeting adjourned, Karen strutted out like she'd won. She didn't realize she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Angela and I walked home in silence. But as soon as we shut our front door, I turned to her and said, "That's it. She just wrote her own downfall." Angela touched my arm gently. "Don't do anything rash," she whispered. But it wasn't rash. It was righteous. Karen had mocked a cancer patient in public, threatened double fines, and openly plotted eviction. She thought her clipboard was stronger than truth. What she didn't know was that I had already started a file, dates, letters, audio recordings. And after tonight, I had witnesses too. Karen wanted a war. Fine. But she was about to learn that when you poke at someone long enough, eventually you find out who they really are. And she was about to find out she had been poking the sheriff. After that HOA meeting, I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen had reached her peak. She'd had her performance, her spotlight, her dramatic jabs at my wife in front of the neighbors. Usually bullies feel satisfied once they get their applause. But Karen wasn't like most bullies. She didn't want applause. She wanted control. And she wasn't finished. It started with the bylaws. A week later, we got a notice in the mail. Amendment 14B. All residents must maintain hair in a neat and socially appropriate style. Failure to comply constitutes a breach of community standards. Angela read it, her lips pressed tight. They actually wrote this into the rules. Just for me, I took the paper, scanned it, and immediately spotted the flaws. Wrong format. Wrong signature line. The HOA attorney's stamp wasn't even there. It was a forgery. A bad one. Karen had literally typed up a fake bylaw, slapped a number on it, and mailed it out like it was gospel. She was so desperate to win that she was willing to commit fraud. And she didn't stop there. Soon photos started circulating around the neighborhood. At first, I thought they were just whispers, rumors carried through fence lines and mailboxes. But one afternoon, a neighbor quietly handed me an envelope. Inside were copies of flyers Karen had distributed. Angela's face zoomed in, her bald head circled in red like she was a criminal suspect. Underneath the words, "This household is destroying property values. Demand compliance. Protect your investments." I could feel my blood pressure spike just holding the paper. Angela, though, surprised me. She stared at the flyer, then laughed softly. She thinks this makes me weaker. She has no idea how strong she's making me. But later that night, I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumped. She didn't notice me at first. Her hands trembled as she whispered to herself, "Am I making life harder for everyone that broke something in me?" Cancer was already eating away at her energy, her health. Now Karen was trying to eat away at her spirit. I sat down beside her, took her hand, and said firmly, "Listen to me. You are not the problem. Karen Island. You're the reason this house is a home. You're the reason I even fight. Don't you dare let her convince you otherwise." Angela blinked back tears, nodded, and leaned her head on my shoulder. But inside me, something shifted. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was determined. So I started treating it like an investigation. I cataloged every flyer, every fake bylaw, every letter. I photographed them, scanned them, time-stamped them. I built a timeline piecing together Karen's harassment like a prosecutor preparing a case. And then came the night I caught them. It was just past midnight. I was reviewing paperwork in my home office when I noticed headlights flash across our lawn. Quiet, slow, not the usual neighbor coming home late. I stepped outside, staying in the shadows, and there they were, two of Karen's so-called HOA enforcers. Big guys in cheap tactical vests snapping photos of my house with long lenses. One of them even aimed the camera at the upstairs window where Angela slept. That was it. That was my breaking point. I stepped into the light badge in hand, not flashing it, but letting it gleam just enough in the porch light. "Evening, gentlemen," I called out, my voice low but commanding. They froze like deer in headlights. One of them muttered something about Karen's orders. I walked down the steps slowly, deliberately, the way I'd approach a suspect. "Let me make this simple for you. You're trespassing, you're harassing a cancer patient, and you're doing it under the orders of a woman forging HOA documents. You want to keep pushing, or you want to walk away right now?" They exchanged looks, then practically ran to their car. Tires squealed as they sped off into the night. The next morning, Angela asked what happened. I just kissed her forehead and said they won't be back. But of course Karen wasn't done. By the end of the week, another letter arrived. Final notice: the Carroll household must vacate the premises within 30 days for repeated violations of community standards. Failure to comply will result in forced removal. Forced removal. Eviction. For a bald head. Angela sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her, silent. Finally, she said, "John, what if she actually convinces people? What if we really do lose our home?" I leaned across the table, looked her in the eye, and said, "She won't. I promise you. Because what she doesn't know is that I've been building something stronger than her lies. Evidence. Proof. And when the time is right, we'll end this." Angela reached for my hand. "Promise me you won't do anything that puts your job at risk." I squeezed her hand gently. "I don't need to risk my job. I just need to do it. Because here's the thing about people like Karen, they think the rules bend for them. They think intimidation and paperwork can erase the truth. But I've spent my entire life making sure the law doesn't bend for bullies. And now, with every forged bylaw, every cruel flyer, every midnight photo, Karen was writing her own indictment. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she was clever. But all she was really doing was giving a sheriff every piece of rope she'd need to hang herself. By this point, I thought I had seen every trick in Karen's playbook: fines, fake bylaws, smear campaigns, even late-night goons creeping around my house with cameras. But bullies don't stop when they're cornered. They lash out harder. And Karen was about to cross a line I never imagined anyone would dare. It started with a knock at the door. Angela was in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, sipping the ginger tea that sometimes calmed her chemo nausea. I opened the door and found a deputy from the county sheriff's office, one of my own men. He looked uneasy, hat in hand. "John," he said, glancing past me toward Angela, we got a complaint filed against your wife." My blood ran cold. "What kind of complaint?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Karen Gibson submitted a statement. Claims Angela has been wandering the neighborhood yelling at residents, threatening them. She called her mentally unstable. Said she's a danger to herself and others." I actually laughed, sharp, bitter. "You've known Angela for years. Does she sound like a danger to anyone?" The deputy shook his head quickly. "No, sir. Everyone on the force knows this is nonsense. But the paperwork came in signed by half the HOA board. Technically, we're obligated to at least investigate." Behind me, I heard Angela whisper, "Oh my God." I closed the door halfway, lowering my voice. "Listen to me. This is harassment. I have documents, evidence. Don't you dare put her through any formal process until I hand you the truth. Do you understand?" The deputy nodded. "Yes, Sheriff." He left quietly, clearly torn between duty and loyalty. Angela sat frozen on the couch, hands trembling around her teacup. "John, she's trying to make me out to be crazy, to lock me up." I knelt beside her. "She won't succeed. I won't let her." But deep down, I knew how dangerous this was. A false police report isn't just petty, it's powerful. Once accusations hit paper, they can stain reputations even when they're baseless. And Karen knew that. Over the next week, the whispers grew louder. At the grocery store, I overheard two neighbors muttering, "Did you hear about John's wife? Poor thing, losing her mind." Another one told Angela to her face, "You should get help, dear, before something bad happens." Each time Angela's shoulders slumped a little lower. She was already fighting her body every day. Now she was being forced to fight her own community. That's when I decided no more waiting. It was time to gather every weapon I had. I pulled out the thick file I'd been building for weeks. Letters, fake bylaws, photos of flyers, timestamps of harassment. I added sworn statements from the few brave neighbors willing to stand up for us. One woman admitted she saw Karen drafting flyers at her kitchen table. Another confessed Karen pressured her to sign a witness statement against Angela, but she refused. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. What Karen thought was clever maneuvering was actually her own noose tightening. Still, Karen wasn't done performing. The following Friday, just after sunset, I noticed unusual activity outside. Cars parked along the cul-de-sac, neighbors gathering in clusters, phones ready, and then headlights. A patrol car rolled slowly down the street. Angela, pale and weak from that day's treatment, looked out the window. "John," she whispered, "they're really coming for me." I put my arm around her shoulders, steady and calm. "Let them come." Karen appeared on her front lawn like a queen, awaiting a coronation clipboard in hand. She marched right up to the arriving officers, waving the papers she'd filed. "That's her," she barked, pointing at Angela, who stood quietly on our porch. "That's the unstable one. She's been harassing the neighborhood." Arrest her before she hurts someone. Neighbors gasped, murmured, recorded. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others looked eager for a spectacle. The officers hesitated. They weren't sure how to proceed. Karen shoved the papers at them. You have sworn statements. Do your job. And that's when I stepped forward. I walked out of the house in full uniform, badge-polished, gun-holstered hat on. The crowd fell silent, phones trembling as people adjusted their cameras to capture the moment. Officers, I said firmly, stand down. Karen spun around, stunned. What, you can't interfere. This is a police matter. I let the silence stretch for a moment, then slowly lifted my badge into the air, letting the porch light glint off the metal. It is a police matter, Karen, and you just made the biggest mistake of your life, because I'm the sheriff of this county. Gasps erupted from the neighbors. Phones caught every second. Karen's smug expression melted into shock, then fury. You're abusing your power, she shrieked. You're just trying to protect your criminal wife. I stepped closer, holding up the thick file I'd been compiling. This is a record of every fake bylaw you wrote, every fraudulent letter, every flyer you circulated, and now a false police report. That's slander, harassment, and filing a fraudulent complaint. Do you know what that adds up to? Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected me. The officers glanced at each other, uncertain. I looked at them, calm but commanding. You don't take orders from her. You take orders from me. And I'm telling you, this woman is under investigation for multiple crimes. Neighbors started murmuring louder. Some shouted about time, others clapped. One elderly man called out, "We're with you, Sheriff." Angela stood quietly beside me, hand in mine, her bald head shining in the porch light like a crown. And for the first time in weeks, I saw her smile. Karen, however, wasn't done fighting. She screamed at the top of her lungs, "You'll regret this, all of you, he's lying, she's a danger, I'm protecting this neighborhood," but her voice cracked. And no one believed her anymore. Because that night, the truth had stepped out of the shadows wearing a badge, and Karen's lies didn't stand a chance. The night Karen called the police to my house should have been the end of it. A rational person would have backed down after the sheriff himself told her to stop. But Karen wasn't rational, she was obsessed. When the lies didn't work in private, she decided to double down in public. She wanted a spectacle, and she got one. It was the following Saturday late afternoon when I heard the commotion outside. Angela was resting after another round of chemo, her body tired, her face pale but still beautiful in its strength. I stepped out onto the porch and instantly knew something was wrong. The entire cul-de-sac was filling with people. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to us in weeks now gathered on their lawns, whispering, filming with their phones. Karen stood at the center of it all, clipboard raised like a general's sword. Behind her were the same two HOA enforcers I had chased off, weeks before, burly red-faced men who looked more like hired muscle than neighbors. And then came the sound that turned my stomach: police sirens. 2 squad cars rolled up slowly, lights flashing but sirens off. Karen strutted toward them, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Officers, there she is. That's the unstable woman I told you about." She jabbed her finger toward my wife, who had stepped quietly onto the porch beside me, holding my arm for balance. Angela stood tall, scarf slipping off her bald head, exposing the truth Karen wanted to hide. She didn't cower. She didn't run. She simply looked at Karen with calm dignity, her hand trembling only slightly in mine. Karen whipped around to the crowd, shouting, "Neighbors, you all know what I've said. This woman refuses to comply with our standards. She's brought shame to this community, and now the law will take her away before she causes more damage." The officers glanced at each other, uncertain. One of them, a rookie I recognized from the academy, looked visibly uncomfortable. He knew me, he knew my wife, but Karen shoved a folder into his hands. "Do your job, arrest her." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones went up higher, lenses pointed at Angela like she was a criminal on display. That was the moment I stepped forward. I walked down the steps slowly, letting every eye follow me, letting the silence grow thick. My uniform was crisp, my badge shining in the golden evening light. The rookie's eyes widened when he saw it, and Karen's face twisted in confusion. I stopped just feet away from her and spoke clearly, my voice carrying over the crowd. "Officers, stand down. Nobody here is under arrest tonight." Karen spun on me, outrage written across every line of her face. "What are you doing? You can't interfere. This is a police matter." I lifted my badge high for all to see. "It is a police matter, and I am the sheriff of this county." The crowd erupted in murmurs, gasps, and shocked exclamations. Neighbors who once looked away from Angela now leaned forward, phones trembling as they recorded history. One man muttered, "Holy hell, He's the sheriff. Karen's jaw dropped, then quickly snapped shut as she tried to recover. You can't just protect her because she's your wife. That's corruption. She's dangerous. I stepped closer, locking eyes with her. You want to talk about corruption? Let's talk about the fake bylaw you wrote. I pulled out the forged amendment 14B from my file and held it up. This is fraud. Karen's face paled. I flipped through the file, holding up flyer after flyer with Angela's face defaced and circled in red. This is harassment. I pulled out the signed false statements she had pressured her board to create. This is filing false police reports. The officers shifted uncomfortably. The rookie cleared his throat. Ma'am, this is serious, Karen shrieked. No, he's lying. He's twisting everything. You all saw her parading around making us look bad. Angela finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. What you call parading, I call surviving. I shaved my head because cancer was already taking it. I walk outside bald because I refuse to hide in shame. And if that makes me dangerous in your eyes, then maybe the problem isn't me. The crowd fell silent. You could hear the wind rustling through the trees. Even the enforcers behind Karen shifted uncomfortably, suddenly looking less confident. I stepped forward one last time, lowering my voice, so only Karen and the cameras close enough could hear. This ends tonight. Either you walk away, or I put you in cuffs right here in front of everyone. For a split second, I saw the panic in her eyes, the cracks in her confidence. But Karen wasn't built to admit defeat quietly. She screamed, pointing wildly at me. You're abusing your power. You'll regret this. All of you will. But her voice was drowned out by something she hadn't anticipated: applause. It started with one clap, then another, then the whole crowd. Neighbors who had been silent for weeks now stood united, clapping, cheering, even shouting Angela's name. Stay strong, Angela, one woman cried. We're with you. Karen's face contorted red with fury as she realized the truth. The neighborhood no longer feared her. I looked at the officers and nodded. Escort her back to her property, and if she interferes again, she'll face formal charges. Karen screamed one last time, something about conspiracies, corruption, injustice, but it was drowned out by the sound of her own footsteps as she was led away. Angela leaned against me, exhausted but smiling. You didn't just stop her, she whispered. You broke her spell. I kissed her forehead gently. No, love. You did that just by standing tall. That night, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the crowd dispersed, I felt something shift in our neighborhood. Fear had been broken. Karen had been exposed. And for the first time in months, Angela walked into our home without a weight on her shoulders. But deep down, I knew this wasn't quite over. Karen had lost her stage tonight, but bullies don't surrender easily. And I was ready. Because now the whole neighborhood knew exactly who we were and exactly who she was. The public confrontation should have been enough to stop Karen, but I knew better. People like her don't disappear into the night quietly. They scheme, they double down, and they cling to power until it slips through their fingers. So while Karen raged inside her house, I spent the next few days preparing the final blow. First, I organized the evidence. I laid everything out on the kitchen table: the forged bylaws, the flyers defaming Angela, the letters taped to our door, the recordings of Karen's voicemails. Every piece of paper was a brick in the wall she had built around herself. And now that wall was closing in. Angela watched me work, sipping her tea. You look like you're building a case. I smiled faintly. Because I am. You're not doing this just for me, are you? She asked softly. I shook my head. Number. I'm doing it for every neighbor she's ever bullied. Every person too scared to stand up to her. You just happen to be the one she underestimated most. Angela reached across the table, squeezing my hand. Even sick and exhausted, her strength amazed me. Then end it, she whispered. And that's exactly what I planned to do. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The HOA board announced an emergency meeting to address the situation. Karen clearly thought she could salvage her power, maybe even spin the confrontation as a misunderstanding. But I had other plans. That evening, the community center was packed again. Neighbors filed in, phones at the ready, whispering excitedly. Karen stood at the front with her usual clipboard. Though her confidence seemed thinner now, her smile forced. Residents of Maple Crest, she began. I know there has been confusion. Rumors, even slander, spread about your HOA board. I assure you, everything I have done has been to protect this community. Her voice quavered slightly, but she pressed on. One household has repeatedly defied our standards, and certain individuals have tried to paint me as a villain. But you all know me. You know I act only for the good of Maple Crest. Murmurs spread through the room. Some nodded, clinging to her authority. Others looked skeptical, remembering the spectacle on my lawn. I let her talk. I wanted her to dig the hole deeper, and she did. She accused Angela again, waving her hands dramatically. She called me biased, unfit to intervene. She even claimed the police presence last week was staged. Finally, I stood, slowly, deliberately. The room quieted. "Karen," I said, my voice carrying across the room, "you've had your say. Now it's my turn." I walked to the front, file in hand. All eyes followed me. "Neighbors, you've heard accusations, insults, and lies. Tonight you'll see the truth." I opened the file and held up the forged bylaw. "This amendment you all received. It's fake. No attorney signature, no legal record. Karen fabricated it." Gasps erupted. Next, I displayed the flyers. Angela's bald head circled in red, the cruel captions beneath. "These were distributed by Karen. That's harassment." I played a recording of one of her voicemails on speaker. "If you don't comply, we'll make sure you're forced out. Your kind doesn't belong here." The room fell into stunned silence. Then I dropped the hammer. "Karen filed false police reports accusing my wife of being unstable and dangerous. Those signatures she collected, half of them are forged. The rest were coerced." Karen's face turned crimson. "Lies, all lies," she shouted. But the neighbors weren't buying it anymore. Whispers rose into open outrage. "She forged documents," one man said. "She lied to the police," another gasped. A woman stood up, pointing at Karen. "You told me if I didn't sign I'd be fined. You threatened me." The room erupted. Dozens of voices shouting at once, condemning Karen, demanding answers. The board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing their queen bee had turned toxic. I raised my hand for silence. "Neighbors, as sheriff, I've already forwarded this evidence to the county prosecutor. Karen Gibson will be facing charges of harassment, fraud, and filing false reports." The roar that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard at an HOA meeting. Applause, cheers, even laughter. It was as though months of fear and silence had burst open all at once. Karen tried to shout over the noise, but her voice was drowned out. Her enforcers had quietly slipped out the back door, abandoning her. Finally, 2 officers, my deputies, entered the room. They walked straight to Karen. One of them recited the words I had spoken so many times myself. "Karen Gibson, you are under arrest." The sight of her being handcuffed right there in the community center where she had ruled like a tyrant was something no one would forget. Neighbors filmed every second, their faces lit with vindication. Angela, sitting in the front row, didn't clap or cheer. She simply sat tall, her bald head gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her dignity untouchable. As Karen was led out screaming about conspiracies and corruption, I turned back to the neighbors. "You don't have to live in fear anymore. The board will appoint new leadership. And from now on, this HOA will serve the community, not the other way around." The applause grew louder, filling the hall. For once, it wasn't about me or even about Karen. It was about freedom from her pettiness, her cruelty, her reign of intimidation. Angela slipped her hand into mine, smiling faintly. "You did it," she whispered. I squeezed her hand gently. "Number, we did it." That night, as we walked home under the stars, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, safer. And though Karen was gone, her shadow lifted. I knew the real victory wasn't just her downfall. It was the way Angela held her head high, unashamed, unbroken. She had been the target, but she walked away the hero. Karen's arrest didn't just ripple through Maple Crest, it sent shockwaves. The same neighbors who once whispered behind Angela's back now knocked on our door with casseroles, flowers, or simply apologies. For weeks, people approached Angela on her morning walks, some in tears, telling her they admired her strength. But let me tell you, the fallout for Karen was brutal. She was charged with harassment, fraud, falsifying HOA records, and filing false police reports. Her clipboard empire crumbled overnight. The board held an emergency vote and stripped her of the presidency, embarrassed by their own complicity. For years, they had let her run unchecked. Now they were desperate to distance themselves from her. At her arraignment, Karen stood pale and trembling, her once perfect hair disheveled. Gone was the queen of the cul-de-sac, barking orders and handing out fines. In her place stood a woman exposed for what she truly was, a petty tyrant who tried to destroy a cancer patient to protect property values. Meanwhile, Angela blossomed. One sunny afternoon, she stepped outside without her scarf, for the first time since shaving her head. Children waved at her, neighbors smiled. Not one person looked away. Her bald head no longer symbolized sickness to the neighborhood, it symbolized resilience. I'll never forget the sight of her walking down Maple Crest Drive, back straight, chin lifted as if daring anyone to shame her again. But no one did. They clapped, they cheered, they called her a warrior. It wasn't just Angela who gained back her dignity. The neighborhood itself began to heal. Without Karen's grip, people started talking again, sharing food, helping each other with yard work. For the first time since we'd moved in, Maple Crest actually felt like a community. One evening at a neighborhood gathering, an elderly man who had lived there longer than anyone approached me. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Sheriff, I owe you an apology. I saw what Karen was doing. I stayed quiet. I was afraid. But you reminded us all that silence is how bullies thrive. Thank you for standing up." I shook his hand firmly. "You don't owe me thanks. Thank Angela. She's the one who stood tall when everyone else looked away." Angela blushed at the attention, but I could see how much it meant to her. She wasn't just surviving cancer anymore, she was thriving in spite of it. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. The prosecutor pursued her case aggressively. She was convicted of harassment and filing false reports, fined heavily, and barred from holding any HOA office again. The very system she had weaponized was now the one that punished her. And in the quiet after the storm, I found myself reflecting on everything we'd endured. Cancer is a cruel enemy. It doesn't play by rules, doesn't care about dignity or fairness. But what shocked me most in this journey wasn't the disease. It was the cruelty of a neighbor who thought she could use it as a weapon. Karen believed appearances mattered more than humanity. She believed a bald head was uglier than a blackened soul, but she was wrong. Angela taught me that strength isn't loud. It doesn't scream or bully or wave a clipboard in people's faces. Real strength is walking outside bald, smiling at your neighbors and daring them to see the person, not the illness. And when I finally held Karen accountable, it wasn't revenge. It was justice. For Angela. For every neighbor she had intimidated. For everyone who's ever been shamed for something they didn't choose. That night, after Karen's sentencing, Angela and I sat on the porch together. The cicadas hummed in the distance, the streetlights glowing softly. She leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, "Do you think it's over?" I kissed the top of her head gently. "It's over, love. She can't hurt us anymore." Angela smiled, eyes glistening. "Then, maybe, just maybe, I can focus on healing now." And in that moment I realized the real victory wasn't that Karen had been handcuffed. It was that Angela finally felt free again. Life has a way of testing us in places we least expect. For Angela, the test was cancer. For me, it was watching how the world treated her while she fought it. What I learned is this: bullies don't always look like schoolyard thugs. Sometimes they wear blazers, hold clipboards, and smile while they destroy others in the name of rules. But dignity cannot be legislated away. Compassion cannot be fined. And love, real, unconditional love, will always stand taller than cruelty. Angela taught me that. She reminded me that even in weakness there is strength, even in sickness there is beauty, and even in the face of hate, kindness is the greatest rebellion. So if you're listening to this, I want you to remember, don't let anyone shame you for what you're going through. Don't let appearances define your worth. Stand tall even when it feels impossible. And when you see someone being bullied, be the one who speaks up. Silence is how tyrants win. Courage is how they fall. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because you never know when the next HOA drama might make you rethink what true justice looks like.